to even service, which destroys our creditworthiness to borrow further as is necessary to maintain a vital circulation, which of course explains all of the present phenomena in that they're pouring money into circulation because money is leaking out of circulation in the way of servicing debt. So I say, furthermore, beyond this point of inevitable terminal failure that I've just made, I say, furthermore, all the while subject to this process, ever more of this circulation would be dedicated to servicing this ever-escalating sum of debt, leaving ever less to sustain the industry, which is obligated to do so, and therefore making it ever less possible and eventually mathematically impossible entirely to sustain the higher prices that industry is forced to charge by interest merely to maintain vital margins of solubility, which is another reason that the system fails, of course. And my teacher stood there silently turning redder and redder and redder in the face. And finally, after great deliberation, he muttered back, he says, "By God, I think you're right again." So, teachers didn't question me if I brought up the mathematic improprieties of anything, and for some reason, math is just very wieldy to me. I see the math of everything around me. In any case, 16 years old, I go home from high school, realizing I have an important idea, and realizing some of the most important things about it is that these rhetorical questions that I had just asked and the explanation that I gave within them implied that there was one and one only absolute solution for two things, two fatal injustices against us, and those are inflation and deflation, and what I usually give as a third categoric fault of any prospective monetary thesis is inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness by interest. How do you solve inflation and deflation? It's second-grade math, and I mean that we as a people merely submit to the preposterous lies which are told us about fighting inflation by increasing interest rates amounts to this. Basically, by increasing interest rates, you escalate the rate of failure, you escalate the cost of money, so much so that you're paying so much more for your debts that you can't afford to pay the increasing prices that industry is forced to charge by interest. So you're merely escalating the rate of failure and pretending that you're saving us from cost when in fact you're transmitting the cost to apply to indebtedness versus the margins of solubility that preserve the very industry which preserves our jobs even, you see. So this idea that we allow the Federal Reserve, for instance, to go unchallenged in this perpetual assertion, which I've heard my entire life, that they're protecting us from interest, or from price inflation by raising interest rates, which I've just proved to my high school teacher are in fact the only systemic cause of price inflation. Interest is the only systemic cause of price inflation. Why? Because the only tools of the obfuscation of the currency affect either volume or cost. And being, as we proved in the first rhetorical question, that there is no such thing, it's mathematically impossible to suffer circulatory inflation where debts are merely collateralized, therefore volume can't be the problem. And so, since the only other tool or effect of the obfuscation of our currency is to affect cost through interest, and interest inherently multiplies artificial indebtedness until we suffer a terminal sum of artificial indebtedness, all the while dedicating ever more of a circulation to sustaining the escalating sum of debt, forcing industry to saddle this debt on its shoulders, while ever less of the circulation can be dedicated to sustaining the industry which is obligated to do so. This explains why we have price inflation. It's interest. So, our first categoric fault of any prospective monetary thesis I give is inflation, deflation, and maldisposition. I'll define the terms as I go. Maldisposition is what I give to be this dedication of ever more of a circulation to servicing debt versus sustaining the industry which is obligated to do so. How do you solve maldisposition? Only by eradicating interest. How do you solve inflation and deflation, which the three together I give as the first categoric fault of any prospective monetary thesis? You solve all three together by eradication of interest, as I've already said, which solves maldisposition. And the other issue is inflation and deflation. And of course, as my teacher gave the definitions of inflation and deflation as increases or decreases in circulation per goods and services, then only a circulation which vacillates upward and downward with the existing volume of goods and services solves inflation and deflation. A circulation which is at all times equal to the remaining value of represented property alone solves inflation and deflation. And there is one and one only way to do that, and that is an obligatory schedule of payment which pays and retires principal at the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related value of represented property. So in turn, a $100,000 home with a 100-year lifespan under a mathematically perfected economy costs us overall $1,000 a year, or $83.33 a month. And obviously we realize we would have negligible, if any, homelessness or foreclosure under a mathematically perfected economy then, which merely eliminates exploitation from the equation and allows us, therefore, to trade an equal measure of our production for the production of a house, for instance.
Al, are you trying to?
I'd like to ask a question, Mike.
Well, let me get through these three categoric faults first, because I'm going to have to come back to that, and the audience won't understand where the hell we are after that, if I may, because I may even answer your question, because what we have to understand is what the problems are. So our first problem is inflation, deflation, and maldisposition, which I give to be the first categoric fault of any prospective economy. I usually give the other fault that I've already mentioned, which is inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness by interest. I give it last, and its obvious singular solution is eradication of interest. Now, people will have a question in their mind: who is going to loan us money if it's not subject to interest? A bit further in the discussion, I will prove that you do not borrow money from banks. All banks do is publish evidence of our promissory obligations to each other. And this is an incredibly vital thing for us to understand, or we will succumb to the present failure because we will be unable to agree upon solution. So, as I say, there are only three categoric faults of any prospective economy. The third I usually give is the one I haven't mentioned yet. I usually give second in the order, and that is systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. Well, I went home from school this day realizing that I had understood that there is one solution for the categoric faults that we've already mentioned. But what about anything and everything else? And over the next just few weeks, I did a tremendous amount of thinking. What about this? What about that? What about anything? I try to think of examples of any prospective further fault of any prospective monetary theory. And suddenly it dawned on me that there was a pattern to every example I could come up with. It either fell into our first or third categoric faults, or it fell into a second categoric fault, which I just given. And the very reason was, the only tools to corrupt actual economy or subvert actual economy were volumetric or cost. And so this is this explicit pattern is expressed in the exact wording of this second categoric fault that I give, which is, again, systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property. That is, that somehow, by manipulating volume or cost through interest, the system adversely manipulates the cost of property or the value of property, or the cost of money or the value of money. So these three, being as these are the only tools of which manifest, well, let's say tools of the obfuscation, they comprise these three categoric faults in and of themselves. And once I made that perception of this pattern, then and then alone is it actually possible to prove that there is one and one only mathematically perfected economy. So in the course of the rest of this evening's discussion, we will express this proof possibly in many different ways, but in the end what we are proving is the only monetary solution, that is the only integral solution of 1, inflation, deflation, and maladisposition; 2, of systemic manipulation of the cost or value of money or property; and 3, inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness by interest. The only integral solution of those three categoric faults is pathetically simple. So pathetically simple that we all should adduce it already from the explanation that I've given already. And that is an eradication of interest and an obligatory schedule of payment at no less than the rate of consumption or depreciation of the related property, which payment retires principal at that rate. Now, why is that the solution? It solves inflation and deflation by maintaining a perpetual 1-to-1-to-1 relationship between the remaining circulation, the remaining value of represented property, and in fact a remaining obligation to pay just that for the remaining value of the represented property. It makes both debtor or obligor, as I prefer to call them, and creditor both overseers of the perpetual value of money in the only truly free market system where we indeed agree upon whatever we will pay for each other's production, with no more than what we figure to be a sufficiently equivalent volume of our own production. Basically, then, we could express mathematically perfected economy yet another way, and that is that it's the utter eradication of exploitation through a medium of exchange. And this degree of exploitation is utterly phenomenal, because in every case you have the increasing of the cost of everything by interest, all the sum of interest which is paid, which in the case of a house may be 3 or 4 or 5 times the 4 times the principal. So what is stolen from us in interest is phenomenal, but what you have to realize, what all of us have to realize, is it's mathematically impossible to suffer anything but the present terminal failure, and this failure can only get worse. And each of us can understand this from all of the facts which are everywhere around us. Why? Because anything that even